So you're suffering with high anxiety levels. Maybe you've been going through this for some time and you just want it to stop now. Well, in this video, I'm going to explain the steps we need to take to come out the other side of our anxiety issues and feel normal again. And the strange thing is, it's probably completely the opposite of what you've been doing so far. So welcome back to my channel. I'm Tim Box. I'm a mind coach, and for more than a decade now, I've been working with people to help them get the other side of their anxiety issues. One of the most common things I hear people say is that they want to get back to what they recognize as normal. The good news is that every human being on the planet can make the changes required to get beyond their anxiety issues. It doesn't matter what we've been diagnosed with or how long we've been suffering with this. It's a basic human trait that our brains continue to grow and learn no matter how old we get. So if you're watching this video questioning your ability to change, then let's dispel that fear right now. However, a big reason why people remain stuck in a state of high anxiety for extended periods of time, sometimes many years, is because they find themselves desperately searching for the old version of themselves that they remember from the time before anxiety struck. They want to get back to that version of themselves. However, the desire to go back is ultimately what stops us making the necessary changes. We can't go back to a time before we'd been through what we've been through and learnt what we've learnt. Our mind has made many fundamental shifts in its understanding over the years. We shouldn't be seeking to undo those learnings, but rather seek out what we need to learn next to get to the other side. Our attempts to go back are the problem, and we only get the other side of our anxiety issues by moving forwards. So how do we do that? Well, before I get to what we need to know and what we need to do to make that positive shift, there are a few fundamentals we first need to understand. All too often with anxiety, we hinder our recovery progress by trying to achieve this imagined state of zero anxiety. We're doing this because we remember a time before all this started when we weren't anxious. We assume that a full recovery means feeling no anxiety whatsoever, and thus we perceive any slight feelings of anxiety to mean we're just not there yet. Or maybe we start to feel better but have concerns about the possibility of anxiety returning. Then of course, these concerns just create the very anxiety we're living in fear of. But we're overthinking things here. In truth, we were always anxious. Anxiety is a normal, healthy emotion that we're meant to feel pretty much every day. It's the emotion that dictates where our conscious focus goes from moment to moment. It's the emotion that reminds us to send the important email or study for the big test, or makes us check our pockets for our keys before we walk out the front door. Anxiety always was and always will be there. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, I get that anxiety is a normal emotion, but what I'm feeling now is way beyond that. I certainly never felt any of this back then. And of course not, because the days you remember as anxiety-free came before you started to regard anxiety as a problem. Anxiety posed no threat to you, so you barely noticed the times when you felt anxious and simply focused instead on what you were anxious about. As a result, you never engaged in the second fear, the anxiety about anxiety. The second fear is the main reason we create high anxiety out of mild anxiety, and also why normal anxiety becomes disordered anxiety. And this brings us neatly on to the next point. When we suffer with high anxiety, we might find ourselves constantly checking to see how anxious we currently are. We'll often perform this bodily self-scan, maybe dozens of times a day, sometimes multiple times an hour. All this does, of course, is create the very sensations we are trying desperately not to find. We're hoping to check for anxiety and find that everything is normal, but scanning for anxiety wasn't what we were doing when we felt normal. It's like checking our house for an intruder. We're inevitably going to open the door to each room with a fair degree of trepidation and anticipatory anxiety. Normal isn't checking for intruders. Normal is sitting on the sofa watching Netflix. So in this instance, it's the constant checking for anxiety and the continuing quest for normality that keeps us from achieving it. Normal's not achieved by repeatedly checking whether or not we're normal. So this next one you might file under things I definitely already knew, but it's worth repeating that what we regard as normal changes every single day of our lives. As I've already mentioned, our brain is constantly rewiring our quadrillions of synaptic connections in response to the information it's receiving via our five senses. As such, change is constantly occurring. You might think you have a very steady and unchanging view of what normal is to you, but in truth, your normal is in constant flux. Just take a look back at photos you posted on social media a few years ago, and you'll remember a very different version of you at a very different phase in your life. Any attempt to chase down the normal you felt before anxiety became a major factor in your life, well, it's kind of futile. The normal you knew then, you've long since evolved beyond. So it's no wonder we feel stuck when we're constantly trying to go backwards to find a person that stopped existing years ago. So with all of that in mind, instead of trying to return to how we felt previously, we need to be fully committing to pressing ahead and finding the version of ourselves that gets the other side of all of this. Instead of trying to take steps back to where we were, we're better served by taking the next steps forwards. We don't walk forwards by facing backwards, and we don't forge ahead in our life by living in the past. Focusing our attention toward our destination is what's needed here, and that generally involves learning the things we need to learn to become who we ultimately want to be. Only then can we live the life we want to live. So our new normal might not resemble the old one as much as we originally thought it should, but I'll often hear clients at the end of the work we do together tell me that in a strange way, they're actually grateful for having gone through all the high anxiety. And this is because they regard the new version of themselves as a much better version than the one they left behind. This new version is less naive, more experienced and resilient, and no longer vulnerable to high anxiety. So what do we need to know to get there? Every client I've ever seen might have been going through their own particular story and their own unique issues. But the problem can almost always be boiled down to one of two things, either a conflict or a confusion in their subconscious. And when it comes to high anxiety, it's nearly always the second one, confusion. So for example, the person suffering from social anxiety has begun to mistakenly overstate the threat offered by a negative judgment from others. Someone dealing with health anxiety has started to become overly concerned about the potential likelihood of life-threatening illness. In some way, our emotional responses have started to feel inappropriate because a part of our subconscious has made a mistake in its threat assessment and created a confused emotional response. The most common area where my clients are experiencing a confusion in their subconscious is in how threatening they perceive anxiety itself to be. For whatever reason, we start to perceive anxiety and feeling high levels of it as an indicator of illness or a mental malfunction. And as a result, anxiety itself becomes perceived to be the big threat. But experiencing high, even debilitating levels of anxiety, it's not a malfunction. It's your mind and body responding perfectly healthily and appropriately to the belief that we're in danger. It's called the stress response, aka fight or flight, aka fear. The problem has occurred because we've started to mistakenly interpret anxiety as dangerous. And in truth, anxiety isn't a threat at all. It can't hurt, damage, or kill us, and, as we've already mentioned, is a healthy and essential emotional response. So, what if your subconscious was now able to stand down? What if it now understood that feeling seemingly inappropriately high levels of anxiety wasn't ever a malfunction? It was just a mistake we made at some point about the threat anxiety poses. What might change about our automatic responses if they were no longer just reacting to perceived threat? And if you're watching this shouting at the screen that you have an anxiety disorder, which of course means that anxiety is a threat, then I've potentially got some good news. If you look up the word disorder in the dictionary, you'll find the definition, a state of confusion. Disorder is not an illness we're afflicted with. Disorder is not permanent. Disorder simply describes our current state of mind. Disorder is temporary. As soon as the confusion that caused it is cleared up, there's no more disorder. As soon as our mind stops treating anxiety like a threat, we potentially create the environment where our mind can switch off the fight or flight response, return to comfort, and achieve that normal we've been looking for. But of course, it won't be the old version of normal. It will be a brand new normal. So what does this new normal look like? How will we know when we find it? Well, no matter how far the other side of our anxiety issues we might get, feeling anxious will still be a thing. Day-to-day anxiety isn't something that's meant to go away, it's functional. It helps us focus on what's important. And we know that sometimes those anxiety levels will be high, but we also know that's only because some days we have more important things to focus on. And we know that there might well be times when we feel higher levels of anxiety than we think is appropriate for our circumstances. But we also know that's just because we're human, and every human being will have some things that get them more concerned than they know they really need to be. But the one thing we won't get anxious about anymore is how anxious we are. Of all the things we might feel threatened by in life, we now know that we never need to feel threatened by our own emotions. So if you ask those that have gotten the other side of their anxiety issues how they did it, they often can't really put their finger on what it was that made the difference. But many of them will at some point say that for whatever reason, they just stopped paying attention to anxiety, and as a result it just kind of went away. And this happened not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped fearing. At some point their mind worked out that anxiety itself was of no threat. So if you're watching this video because you've wanted to feel normal again, remember, we only stopped feeling normal because at some point, for whatever reason, we started to fear our own anxiety. We get the other side of this by realizing that we have nothing to fear from our own emotions. And this is why we're not simply returning to our old self. That version of us was perhaps, without realizing it, vulnerable to confusing anxiety as a threat. The new version is the one that's no longer vulnerable to that misunderstanding. But hey, if you've made it this far in the video, then I'm sure you probably have something you'd like to add to what I've discussed here today. So please leave a comment below. In particular, I'd like to know, have you at some point started to fear your own anxiety response? When and why do you think that happened? Do you still fear it? Let me know in the comments. And if this video has resonated with you and you'd like to go a bit further on this journey with me, then check out the next one that explains a bit more about how we make positive changes in our own mind.